Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so today we wanted to cover an area that probably doesn't get too much coverage, but it might give you an idea of some areas which are emerging and places that are open for investment as well. So we're calling this the energy behind green alternative fuels, and that's what that energy is required to produce those green fuels. So there's a lot of conversation around the promise of future alternative fuels, and those future alternative fuels, those green ones, the ones which are carbon-free. And a common question in the industry, and we heard it yesterday and we've heard it today, is what that fuel is going to be that's commonly adopted. And that's driven, of course, by the Paris Agreement and of course, by the IMO greenhouse gas strategy. So there's that drive towards the reduction in emissions. So currently, predominantly, fuels such as hydrogen and ammonia are produced from natural gas and steam methane reforming, along with carbon capture. So there is an alternative route to production, and green hydrogen and green ammonia can be produced for the use of renewables. And this is where the likes of wind, solar, and nuclear come into play and have a significant role in this. So I'd like to introduce you to my fellow panelists today. We've got Edgar Kerkwijk, who's a board member of Asia Wind Energy Association. We have Bob Effendi, who's the Chief Operating Officer for Thorcon Power, with a nuclear project. And Nizar Damri, who's the Head of Business Development, Renewables Asia Pacific with Equinor. So to start us off, I'd like to ask the panel to provide a brief overview of their organization's role in advancing renewable energy. And could you share your unique approach and how it contributes to the broader landscape of sustainable energy production? I'd start off asking Edgar about that with his role in the Asian Wind Energy Association.
Yeah. So the Wind Association was set up in the end of 2016 to... Yeah, it works. Okay. As a typical trade association, so what we do is we help the wind, both onshore as well as offshore industry, to gain more knowledge, to expand their activities. Interesting enough, when we started end of 2016, it was really the start of the offshore wind industry in Taiwan, actually in APEC, ex-China. And what we have seen in the last 6-7 years, that a lot more countries have now started to look at offshore wind, because it has some advantages compared to solar or onshore wind. It's a much larger scale, higher capacity factors, and it doesn't inconvene communities or agricultural sectors because it's all offshore. Of course, we have to take care of the fishing communities. And what we now see is that offshore wind is, after Taiwan, it's in Japan, it's in Korea, it's in Australia, it's close to home, Philippines, Vietnam. We even heard about the first project in Bangladesh. So I think it's one of the bigger renewable energy sources that we will see in the next couple of years, and the targets are phenomenal. So I think that a lot will need to be done in this industry.
Okay, thank you. And Bob, if you could fill us in on your area.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. As Mike has mentioned, that I'm Chief Operating Officer of a nuclear company based in Jakarta, Thorcon Power Indonesia. So to start with, I think I would like to say that the biggest news that will hit the energy sector in Southeast Asia is that by next year, the Indonesian government will announce that Indonesia is going nuclear. So I guess this is going to be the biggest news ever. I mean, in these regions, being that we don't have any nuclear power plant right now in Southeast Asia. So the only two countries that's pushing nuclear right now is Indonesia and Philippines. Then looking at the progress, I think Indonesia would be the first one. So I guess this is news to you, to all of you, but if you look at the news in Indonesia, you just need to Google that the National Energy Council of Indonesia and the Minister of Energy and the Parliament has agreed that I mean, we have this debate for 3 decades. That's a long time, 3 decades, and has finally agreed because of the net zero emission target, the climate change target, that finally it cannot be done without nuclear. So it's going to be in place, and by next year, we're going to, that's going to be an announcement. And Thorcon, as Mike have said, our position most likely, of course I said this most likely, is going to be announced as the first company that's going to be built nuclear power plant in Indonesia. So question is, why nuclear and why Thorcon? I think why nuclear, I need to say this a little bit, if you may, Mike, is that as you know, that the fundamentals of energy transition is to phase out coal, right? The problem is phasing down coal is the reliability and the economic. 3 words, basically: anywhere, anytime, cheap, and clean. Now, if we, eliminate the word clean, then any fossil fuel will meet 3 these criteria: anytime, anywhere, and cheap. But if you add clean, I mean, there is no other option than nuclear. There's no other options. So that's why this is why the Indonesian government finally realized that Indonesian government committed that's going to go nuclear, and the target is by 2032 that Indonesia have the first nuclear power plant, and the target is by 2060 we have 54 gigawatts. That's looking at about 150 nuclear power plant in Indonesia operating in about 38 years from now. And why Thorcon? Because we are a low-pressure reactors, so our cost is practically cheaper than coal. That's our slogan. Because in our philosophy, if you cannot compete then with coal, then every country in the world will be still using coal. Case in point, China. So that our cost currently stands at about 3 cents per kilowatt hours, and our capex is about $1,000 per kW, so that's practically cheaper than coal. So we're gonna build it in South Korea and tow it to Indonesia and balance it down. It's 500 megawatts plant, so it's going to be exciting, Mike. And I guess I stop there. So open up to discussion. But I have some comment later on, about the hydrogen production and especially nuclear propulsion, because everybody talking about propulsion here, decarbonizing the marine industry, and for me, the viable path for decarbonizing shipping is nuclear. I'll say that more maybe later. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We will touch on that. Very good. And to you, Nizar, on the role that Equinor is playing in this area.
First, thanks for the invitation, and congratulations, Bob.
Thank you.
That's good news for you, I guess, and for the planet also. When it comes to Equinor, for those who don't know, it's a broad energy company. It's the largest gas supplier to Europe, producing 2 million barrels a day. And we have embarked towards a net zero goal by 2050. So in addition to oil and gas, we have invested heavily in renewables, and offshore wind is the main area of our investments. And this is a simple strategy, because being the largest oil and gas operator, we see clearly synergies with offshore wind and leveraging our competitive skills here. And when it comes to hydrogen, since we produce CH4, there is a clear path to produce H2. So we definitely take a stepwise approach when it comes to the different colors between blue and green, and also across the continents. And when it comes to my role, I'm heading the business development in renewables for Asia Pacific, with the main focus on offshore wind, targeting 4 main countries: South Korea, Australia, Japan, and Vietnam. So these are the countries we are developing projects, and there are also the countries we are monitoring. And Asia Pacific is definitely an exciting region for this technology.
Yeah, I think I'll cover it a little bit later, but yeah, there's a lot of growth happening in the offshore wind sector here, and there's been some interesting reports from GWC, the Global Wind Energy Council, on what we could expect that growth to look like as well as there being certain shortages in the type of support vessels that would be required to cover that. So, following on, I'd like to come to Bob and ask more about the project that Thorcon's been doing in Indonesia. There's been significant strides and a lot of milestones along the way for Thorcon in bringing this technology to make it a reality. Would you be able to share some insights into the regulatory and policy challenges that you've experienced in attempting to bring this to fruition in Indonesia? And also, I wondered if you could also talk about the future projects which you could see for integration into a hydrogen economy.
Thank you, Mike. First of all, my background is actually oil and gas. I spent about 2 decades, more 2.5 years, 25 years in oil and gas. I retired from oil and gas companies in 2013, and back then I see the future has to be nuclear if we go, clean energy. So it's been a roller coaster ride in regulation in Indonesia because the debates of nuclear. And again, like I said, finally in 2000 after the energy crisis, so there's 2 things why drive Indonesia to go with the nuclear is, number one is the energy crisis happening in 2019-20. The reason being is when you look at what's the problem with the energy crisis at that time, I think it's the energy security problems, right? So people don't realize is that nuclear fuel span a long time. When, for example, in our fuel, when you put the fuel there, it stays for 8 years. So you mentioned that you have a fuel that runs for 8 years continuously without stopping. I mean, that's just, you can't imagine that, So the challenges, of course, in Indonesia, not only 2 parts. Number one is the integrating into the energy mix, right? That's part of the energy mix that's now been decided. The second part is actually on the nuclear regulatory body itself, because the current nuclear regulation in Indonesia or all over the world is based on a light water reactor type of reactors, right? Based on water-based reactors. And our design is a molten salt. So it's based on a molten salt, a different kind of reactors, and therefore it has a much higher safety margins because, as you know, water boils at 100 and salt boils at 1,400. So these are the regulatory, but the Indonesian nuclear regulatory body now has acknowledged that it's considered a different type of design. So they are revising and they're, revising their regulatory and to accommodate different, what they call the non-light water reactor regulations. So it's in the process. The other challenges is, I think, is the public acceptance and perceptions, which I see that's the main problem with nuclear. I mean, people kind of surprised if I say nuclear is the safest form of energy. I mean, you just need to Google it, right? It is the safest form of energy if you look at the death per terawatt hour. I mean, it's the smallest. So nuclear actually do not have a actual safety issue. It has a PR issue. It's a public relation issue, public relation perception. I mean, I come from an oil and gas. I mean, oil and gas have more accidents than nuclear power plant in the world, right? So it's a public relation issue. It's a perception issue, not an actual hazard. It's a perceptions. So those are the challenges. Challenges number one is the, like communicating to the government, putting it into stopping the debate. I mean, nuclear has been debating, nonstop for the past 50 years, I think, 30 years. In Indonesia, definitely 3 decades. Second challenges is the nuclear regulatory itself, because I mean, I would say, I'm not coming out from nuclear, so I can say this. I mean, the one that actually put a burden in nuclear itself is the nuclear people itself. I can say that, especially the regulation. So the second is public relations. So those are the three challenges. But thank God that we've done our homework. We've now been doing this for 8 years. So if we did not do the homework, then the government of Indonesia would not put this as a plan or as a policy. So those are the challenges, Mike.
Okay. And with Edgar, in your role in the Asian Wind Energy Association, you obviously get to have a unique overview of what's happening in that environment and in the region. And I wondered if you could share some insights into some of the types of projects that you've been seeing coming through, and areas where you can see like some fast developments happening in this region.
I think that since 2017, I think Taiwan has been quite a success story. But they had been planning that for quite a long time. What we have seen is that other countries now are sort of on the bandwagon to want to develop offshore wind. I think some of these countries are going a bit too fast. For example, in Australia, you see a lot of news about offshore wind. I think they have almost 50 projects, but none of them has been built yet. And they actually have a very small consumption locally. So to have offshore wind in Australia being successful, they will need to export the power, not through a cable, which is technically possible, but not economically. But they will need to export hydrogen. And until hydrogen is not at a certain low level, it's very hard to export renewables. Then looking at some of the other markets like Korea and Japan, they're trying to develop floating wind, so floating offshore wind, which you will hear a lot about, and there's a lot of PR being done on floating offshore wind, but there are a lot of challenges still to be taken. It's, I would not say an unproven technology, because I'm sitting next to one of the biggest developers of floating wind, but there are a lot of challenges, and we hear about the existing projects. One of them is from Equinor, and one of them is, I think, in Scotland, and costs are high, availability of the turbines not always there, they're having to bring them back to different ports because of weather issues. So I think that we need to stay a little bit realistic in offshore wind and not go immediately in floating. Let's do first the fixed bottom ones, the easier projects. Another challenge that we see in offshore wind is that very different compared to oil and gas, or maybe the market that you are in. When oil is at 80, 90, everything is possible. Any crew, any vessel can be chartered, cost, no problem. In offshore wind, we only have seen margins coming down. And governments are very unwilling to actually increase energy tariffs for offshore wind. So while that is coming down the revenue side, you see that the cost for vessels is going up. Availability is is an issue. The turbine is getting bigger. So whatever vessel was built 5 years ago is not suitable for the next wind project because turbines are just much bigger. And we see in some countries like in the US where they even have to start with the first project that companies like Ørsted already think of walking out because they got a tariff which doesn't match their cost. So I think we have to make sure that offshore wind gets their fair chance and at least gets some margin to get developed.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting with some of the support vessels are required, and you say like with things getting bigger, requiring sort of like AHTS vessels of having much higher bollard pull as well. On that, I'd like to bring in Nizar on this as well, because you've got some interesting projects, and it ties into also the hydrogen fuel production as well. Could you fill in on those, and also I saw you had something to say with regards to some of the things that Edgar brought up.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of comments to what Edgar said. I mean, obviously, floating is a less mature technology compared to bottom fixed. I think it was last month we opened the largest floating offshore wind farm in the world. It's called Hywind Tampen. It's 88 megawatt, and it's supplying electricity to our oil and gas platform in VNCS. The next project we have in floating wind is in Korea, and it's 800 megawatt. And obviously, it's 10 times, and you can imagine the cost structure, and I fully agree. It's expensive. The offshore wind industry is going through, I would say, a kind of perfect storm, where you see creeping, increasing costs. and pressure on the electricity prices and lower subsidies, obviously. So this will have to be discussed and, within the industry, but also with the policymakers, which brings me to hydrogen production. Because the way you have to think about it is like a triangle. You have the demand, the customers, you have the policymakers, and you have the suppliers. In an ideal world, these three players talk and establish a predictable frame which allow market players like us to invest into intensive capital projects, right? So, as an example, and answering to your question, in January we signed a cooperation agreement with RWE, which is a German utility. And it was an interesting one because it has three parts. The first one is building CCGTs, which would be hydrogen ready. The second part would be to establish a frame to develop offshore wind projects. And the third would be to establish feasibility studies to look into CO2 pipelines between Germany and Norway. And the jigsaw here is the following. We believe, as I said, in a stepwise approach when it comes to hydrogen. Blue is cheaper, so let's start with blue. Then go to green when the cost curve makes sense for us to have decent returns, to your point, Edgar. So that's why, Norway has CCS potential. And that's the link between the pipeline I mentioned. When you think about blue hydrogen, the CO2 produced by that process would be transported between Germany by this pipeline and stored into CCS fields in Norway. And then these offshore wind projects with RWE could be built into a green hydrogen structure. So it's a whole value chain process that is being discussed. And I mean, the important part also, and if you see the press release, the two CEOs signed it, and behind them there was the Prime Minister of Norway and the German Chancellor. And that's why I'm saying the policymakers need to work closely with the market players and with the customers.
Yeah.
Mike, I'd like to add.
Sure.
I forgot to answer your questions about the integration. That's an important question, actually, because in the energy policy on the energy mix that the Indonesian government are devising, we have a huge portfolio of intermittent renewables. So therefore, as you know, we got a lot of problems. So integration between base load and intermittent become a problem. So one of the solutions that we are constructing is a super grid. So you have a super grid connecting Indonesia all over Indonesia, and that's where nuclear, especially it's like our kind, because we can load follow. So because like, as you know, intermittent, cannot be dispatched or controlled. So you have to have interconnected grids, because right now we have separated grids, right? So we are integrating the grids all over Indonesia. That's become huge super grids because we're looking the intermittent renewables like close to 200 gigawatts. So you need to be matched by a load follow type clean energy, right? Otherwise, then you got a problem of the fluctuation in the frequency and voltage. So then you have also interconnecting with the Asian power grid, connecting from Vietnam all the way to Indonesia. So we got in the next like 20 years, it'll be one gigantic super grid, most likely bigger than what's in Europe, I think. This whole connecting between Southeast Asian and Indonesia, because the agreement has been signed. So therefore, my point is that so we can, like Indonesia, we have nuclear power plant a lot. We can sell clean energy to Singapore or other part of Asian country. So that's point number one. Second, I'd like to also put maybe sort of like a point on the hydrogen, because it's been discussed a lot. What has not been discussed is a nuclear-based hydrogen. They call it the pink hydrogens, right? So all the hydrogen discussion is always based on electrolysis process, right? Electrolysis process. I see the problem with electrolysis process is not the source of energy. Of course, then you have the different kind of energy, but the electrolyzer itself. It's made of iridiums, you know, one of the most expensive metals there is in the earth, and titanium. So, you know, that's becoming a problem. Whether a steam methane reform, you don't need the electrolyzer. So a steam reform methane, I mean, if I have to guess, would cost about $1.50 per kilograms. So this type of electrolysis, you talking about $2, right? So the other part, which is quite viable, I think. I mean, this is not part. It's just I'm reading it. Is a heat-based thermal water splitting. So you need about 1,000 degree, 900 degree heat to split water, and nuclear can do that. Right, so you don't need an electrolyzer. That is an option actually, which has not been discussed. But a company, I think based in Europe, it's called Lucid Catalyst, done a study on this nuclear heat application for hydrogen. They calculated, this is not me talking, that it'll cost about $1 in 2030 for nuclear based hydrogen production, about $1 per kilogram. So that's the option, I think, in the future. I mean, we're not doing hydrogens, but, you know, I think nuclear-based hydrogen should be discussed on the table. Second, the third one, the last one, bear in mind, is propulsions, right? I think propulsions, if we've been talking, one of the most difficult decarbonization is shipping, right? I've touched base on the nuclear-based propulsion system, right? So imagine if you have a ships that, you know, propulsed by reactor that do not need fueling for 8 years or 10 years running. I mean, imagine what that could impact the industry, you know, a ship that can run 8 years non-stop without any refueling. The problem with current, but people don't realize but there's about 160 nuclear power ships currently, but all of them are military. The problem why there is no civilian nuclear power ship is because it's based on pressurized water reactor, which is very expensive, is water-based. But I've done the study with the Indonesian government. If you change it into a molten salt reactor type of reactor, it is a fraction of the conventional ship, a fraction. So some company has been discussing this. You know, I don't need to mention the company because then I'll be promoting them, but we're not doing that. But I think also this is a breakthrough disruptive technology, nuclear in the shipping. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. I think we've covered quite a bit. I think there's opportunity to extend this conversation, that's for sure. There is like a massive energy requirement behind producing the green fuels. There are blue fuels, as Nizar already covered. There could be a transition, or would be a transition between those as green fuels become easier to produce and technologies advance as well in this area. I'd like to thank the three panelists, Bob, Edgar, and Nizar for joining us. And thank you very much for having us, and enjoy your lunch.
Thank you very much.